My name is Pamela. For 10 long years I was a ghost in my own life. I was the invisible wife, the quiet woman in the corner of the room, swallowing the cruel jokes and dismissive glances of my husband's family just to keep the peace. They looked at me and saw a nobody. They didn't know that in the dark, while they slept comfortably in their arrogance, I was silently building an empire. But before I take you back to the beginning of my journey, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to you. From the very bottom of my heart, thank you. Thank you for being here, for sharing your precious time with me, and for opening your heart to listen to my truth. Welcome to Queen's Revenge. If you are watching this right now, perhaps you know exactly what it feels like to be underestimated. Perhaps you know the heavy, lonely ache of biting your tongue while others make you feel small. I want to remind you with all the humility in my soul that your silence is not a weakness. It is simply the quiet soil where your greatest strength is taking root. You are so much stronger than the labels they put on you, and you are entirely capable of building your own kingdom from the very stones they throw at you. If my story resonates with you, and if you find a piece of your own heart in my journey, I gently invite you to subscribe to this channel and become part of our family. Let us rise together. And to all of you who have already subscribed and supported this channel, thank you. I send you my most sincere and heartfelt prayers. May your days be blessed with overflowing wealth, may endless opportunities find their way to your door, and may your lives be rich with a profound happiness that no one can ever take away from you. Now take a deep breath, and let me tell you the story of how the invisible wife finally stepped out of the shadow. They say that the smell of rain on dry earth, petrichor, is the scent of hope. In the small dusty town where I grew up, hope was a tangible thing, etched into the callous palms of my father and the tired, yet resolute, eyes of my mother. We didn't have much, but we had the kind of wealth that doesn't fit into a ledger. Resilience, a fierce work ethic, and a name that stood for integrity. I was Pamela, the girl from a place where every dollar was earned through sweat, and every dream was forged in the fire of necessity. But as I stand now in the sprawling, sterile foyer of my home, a house built of cold marble and echoing silence, that girl feels like a faded photograph. I am now the wife of Mike Sterling, the prodigy, the self-made titan, the man whose family views me as a fortunate footnote in his grand biography. The transition from the warmth of my humble roots to the frigid prestige of the Sterling family wasn't a leap. It was a slow, agonizing submergence. I remember the early days of our marriage with a clarity that stings. I had entered this union with a heart full of fire and a mind sharpened by years of quiet ambition. But the Sterlings, Janet with her pearls that looked like a collar of frozen tears, and Lily with her razor-sharp smiles, had a way of making me feel small. They didn't use hammers to break me. They used 1,000 tiny needles of condescension. "Oh, Pamela, it must be such a relief for you," Janet would say during those suffocating Sunday brunches, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, "to finally be taken care of. After where you came from." I would look at Mike, waiting for the defense, the correction, the acknowledgement that I was his equal. But he would only offer a distracted smile, a pat on my hand that felt like a dismissal. "They don't mean anything by it, Pam," he'd whisper later. "They're just protective." That was the beginning of the great trade. I began to barter my voice for peace. I learned to swallow the retorts that tasted like bile. I became an expert at the vacant nod, the demure downward glance, the role of the stay-at-home wife, who was merely a decorative accessory to Mike's meteoric rise. They saw a woman who spent her days at spas or aimless shopping trips. They saw a vacuum where a personality should be. What they didn't see was the fire burning in the basement of my soul. The loneliness of being underestimated by the world is a heavy burden, but the loneliness of being underestimated by the person who sleeps beside you is a suffocating one. Mike loved me, I truly believe that, but he loved a version of me that didn't exist. He loved the soft place to land, the woman who would listen to his business triumphs without ever mentioning her own. He saw my silence as contentment. He saw my lack of career as a lack of capability. It was in that hollow space of being unseen that my secret world began to take shape. It started with a single laptop, hidden under a stack of home decor magazines. While Mike was out conquering the city, and while Janet and Lily were busy gossiping about which charity gala would afford them the most social capital, I was building. I didn't want a hobby. I wanted an empire. I wanted to prove to the ghosts of my ancestors that their struggle wasn't in vain, and I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't just a shadow in the Sterling household. I remember the naps I would take, hours spent in a locked guest room, eyes strained against the blue light of the screen, analyzing market trends, securing microloans under my maiden name, and negotiating with suppliers who had no idea they were talking to a housewife. I remember the shopping trips where I wasn't looking for designer shoes, but for dilapidated properties and struggling storefronts that had the bones of something great. I chose the restaurant industry because it was visceral. It was about hospitality, about the very thing the Sterlings weaponized, class and service, and turning it into something authentic. I found a crumbling warehouse on the edge of the culinary district. To anyone else it was a ruin. To me it was a sanctuary. I poured my secret savings, my inheritance from my grandmother, and every ounce of my repressed rage into that soil. There were nights when I would return home, my mind buzzing with blueprints and payroll spreadsheets, only to find Mike sitting in his study nursing a scotch. "Rough day?" he would ask, his tone patronizingly gentle. "Just a bit tired from the gardening." I would lie, my heart hammering against my ribs. "You should take it easy, Pam. You have the luxury of not having to worry about the stresses of the real world. Enjoy it." The real world. He had no idea that I was navigating a world far more complex than his. He was playing with his family's safety net. I was walking a tightrope without one. If I failed, I would be exactly what they said I was, a failure who tried to reach above her station. But if I succeeded, the secrecy became my armor. Every insult from Lily about my simple tastes was a brick in the wall of my hidden fortress. Every time Janet explained a complex financial concept to me as if I were a child, I made a mental note to acquire another asset. I was a ghost haunting the corridors of my own life, waiting for the right moment to become flesh and bone. The most profound pain, however, was the realization that my husband didn't want to know me. He preferred the simplicity of the lie. It was easier for him to believe I was a vacuum than to acknowledge that his wife was a predator in the boardroom. He wanted a partner who reflected his glory, not someone who outshone it. As the months turned into years, the restaurant L'Heritage began to breathe. It became the most talked about secret in the city. Critics raved about the mysterious owner, who had an uncanny eye for detail and a soul for service. I would sit at our dinner table, listening to Mike and his father discuss the new player in the market, their voices filled with a begrudging respect they never afforded me. "Whoever owns that place knows their stuff," Mike's father had said once, swirling his wine. "They've got a killer instinct. Rare in this town." I had smiled then, a genuine, terrifyingly sharp smile. "Maybe they just know the value of hard work," I said softly. They had laughed, a dismissive booming sound that echoed through the marble halls. "Hard work, Pamela? It's about strategy. Something you wouldn't understand." I looked down at my plate, the echo of my small-town beginnings ringing in my ears like a battle cry. I wasn't just working, I was waiting. The invisible empire was almost complete, and soon, the silence I had traded for peace would be replaced by a roar they could never ignore. I was no longer just the girl from the dusty town. I was the owner of the shadow they were standing in. To build a kingdom in the light is a matter of ego. To build an empire in the dark is a matter of survival. Every night, after the heavy oak doors of our master suite clicked shut, and Mike's breathing settled into the rhythmic, heavy cadence of a man who believed the world was exactly as he perceived it, my real day began. I would slip out of the silk sheets, those expensive, suffocating fabrics that felt like a gilded shroud, and navigate the darkened hallway of our mansion with the precision of a ghost. I avoided the floorboards that groaned under the weight of secrets. My destination was always the same. The far west wing, a guest suite that Janet had deemed decoratively obsolete, and subsequently forgotten. This was the architecture of my shadow. The room was cold, smelling of stale air and the faint metallic scent of the dormant radiator. But to me it was a cathedral of industry. I would sit on the floor, the glow of my laptop the only lighthouse in a sea of Sterling-imposed obscurity. My fingers, which Lily mocked for their lack of a proper manicure, flew across the keyboard with a ferocity that would have terrified them. The grit of those early months was not glamorous. It was a symphony of clandestine phone calls made from the pantry during Mike's gym hours, muffled conversations with contractors while I pretended to be browsing for curtains. I learned the language of logistics, the jagged syntax of commercial law, and the brutal mathematics of high-stakes investment. I wasn't just opening a restaurant. I was dissecting the very concept of the Sterling's world and rebuilding it under my own banner. I remember the nights when my eyes felt as though they had been rubbed with glass, the blue light of the screen searing into my retinas. I would drink cold, bitter coffee from a thermos I hid in a laundry basket, my mind racing through spreadsheets that detailed the hemorrhaging costs of my first commercial lease. There was no one to tell me, well done. There was no mentor to guide my hand. Every mistake was mine to bleed for, and every victory was a silent firework in the hollow of my chest. The contrast between my midnight reality and my daylight performance was a jagged pill to swallow. "Pamela dear, you look a bit haggard," Janet remarked one Sunday, her voice a polished blade as she daintily sliced into a poached egg. We were at the Sterling estate, a place where the grass was trimmed with surgical precision, and the conversations were even more restricted. "Perhaps you're spending too much time indoors?" A woman without a purpose can often become stagnant. Lily let out a sharp, melodic laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, Mother, don't be so hard on her. Not everyone has Mike's drive. Some people are just born to be the scenery. It's a peaceful life, isn't it, Pam? No deadlines, no pressure. Just existing." I felt the familiar heat rise in my throat, the petrichor of my suppressed rage. I looked at Mike. He was staring at his phone, probably tracking a merger, oblivious to the fact that his sister had just called his wife a houseplant. "I enjoy the quiet," I said, my voice a masterpiece of blandness. "It gives me time to think." "Think about what?" Lily sneered, leaning forward. "What color to paint the powder room? Or which charity lunch to attend so you can pretend to be busy?" I took a slow sip of my tea, the steam ghosting over my face. "I thought about the 4 a.m. acquisition of the warehouse on 5th and Main," I said in the silence of my mind. "I thought about the 3-year revenue projection that places my EBITDA higher than your father's primary firm. I thought about the fact that I am currently your landlord for that boutique you pretend to run, Lily." But aloud I only said, "I think about how lucky I am to have such a supportive family." The irony was a delicious, bitter nectar. I was a titan in the boardroom they didn't know existed, and a ghost in the home I helped fund. The turning point, the first real crack in the shadow, came on a Tuesday in November. I was in my shadow office, staring at a digital bank statement. The first major profit from a subsidiary investment had cleared. It wasn't just a small win, it was a deluge. 6 figures staring back at me in stark, unapologetic black ink. I sat back in the dark, the silence of the mansion pressing in on me. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run into Mike's study, throw the laptop on his desk, and demand he look at me, truly look at me. I wanted to see the shock, the realization that the woman he treated like a fragile porcelain doll was actually a diamond-edged blade. But I stayed still. The secrecy was my power. To reveal it now would be to give them the chance to claim it, to domesticate it, to find a way to make my success a family achievement. No. This belonged to the girl from the dusty town. This belonged to the woman who drank cold coffee in the dark. The next day Mike came home late, looking weary but triumphant. "Big win today, Pam," he said, tossing his blazer onto the sofa. "We closed the Henderson deal. It's going to put us on the map for the next decade." "That's wonderful, Mike," I said, moving to hang up his jacket. I felt the weight of his success. It was loud, boastful, and validated by every person in his circle. "You wouldn't understand the stress of it, though," he said, pouring himself a drink. "The sheer weight of responsibility. Sometimes I wish I could just swap places with you for a day. No worries, no stakes. Just peace." I looked at him, and for a fleeting second the shadow flickered. I saw him not as my husband, but as a stranger who had failed the most basic test of intimacy. He had failed to see my soul. "It must be nice," I replied, my voice as smooth as the marble floor under my feet, "to think that my world has no stakes." He didn't even notice the edge in my tone. He just nodded, drained his glass, and headed upstairs to the world he thought he owned. As I watched him go, I realized that the architecture of my shadow was complete. I had built the walls, the foundation, and the secret passages. I was no longer afraid of their mockery. I was nourished by it. Every aimless afternoon they imagined I spent at the mall was spent in a construction vest, overseeing the installation of the kitchen at Leritage. Every nap was a strategy session with the legal team that cost more than Janet's jewelry collection. I was a ghost, yes. But ghosts have a way of haunting the living when they least expect it. I went back to the West Wing, opened my laptop, and began the final phase of the restaurant's launch. The Sunday brunches would continue. The insults would sharpen. And I would keep biting my tongue until the taste of blood was replaced by the taste of victory. They thought I was a nobody. They were about to find out that a nobody has nothing to lose and everything to take. The announcement came with the practiced casualness of a man who believes he is gifting the sun to someone who has only ever known candlelight. We were in the living room, the evening light bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling windows in jagged streaks of violet and gold. Mike was scrolling through his phone, a smug, triumphant curve to his lips that I had learned to recognize as the precursor to a performance. "I managed to snag a table for Thursday night," he said, not looking up, his voice vibrating with the self-satisfaction of a hunter returning with a rare prize. 7 o'clock. Leritage. I felt a jolt of electricity shoot down my spine, a cold, sharp thrill that nearly made me drop the book I wasn't actually reading. Leritage. My crown jewel. The restaurant that had been my obsession for 2 years. The place where I had personally supervised the installation of the hand-blown glass chandeliers and debated the exact shade of charcoal for the velvet banquettes. That new place. I asked, my voice a steady practice neutral. I heard it's nearly impossible to get a reservation. Mike finally looked at me, his eyes shining with a patronizing warmth. "It is. But I have connections, Pam. My firm handled some of the initial zoning paperwork for the developers. They owe me. I thought it would be a nice treat for you. To see how the other half lives for an evening. Get you out of the house, away from your gardening." The irony was a physical weight in the room, thick enough to choke on. He thought he was using his power to bring me into a world I couldn't possibly understand. He had no idea that the developers he spoke of were mere shells, and the woman sitting across from him was the ghost in the machine that pulled their strings. "That's very thoughtful of you, Mike," I said, the words tasting like copper. "Mother and Lily are coming too," he added, returning to his phone. "Janet's been dying to go. She wants to see if the hype is justified. She's convinced it's probably overpriced fluff, but she wants the social credit of having been there." The arena was set. The days leading up to Thursday were a blur of internal audits and silent preparations. I felt like a general preparing for a siege, except I was the one holding the gates. I made one phone call. Not from the house, but from a burner phone while I sat in my car at a public park. "It's me," I said when the manager, Marcus, picked up. "Ma'am, everything is ready for the VIP tasting on Thursday. We have the—" "I'm coming in as a guest," I interrupted, my heart hammering against my ribs. "With the Sterling party. You are to treat me exactly as you would any other guest. No special attention. No recognition. Do you understand?" There was a pause on the other end. Marcus had seen me in work boots and a dust mask. He had seen me tear apart a floor plan because the flow of the kitchen was 2 inches off. He knew the predator beneath the silk. "As you wish, ma'am. But if they are disrespectful to you." "Especially then," I said, my voice turning to ice. "Let the play unfold as written, Marcus. Just ensure the service is flawless. I want them to have nothing to complain about but their own shadows." Thursday evening arrived with a suffocating humidity that seemed to mirror the tension in my chest. I chose my outfit with surgical intent. A simple, elegant black dress that cost more than it looked, but was deliberately understated. I wanted to be the background. I wanted to be the invisible wife one last time. As we pulled up to the curb of Leritage, the valet, a young man I had personally interviewed and hired, stepped forward. I watched as Mike stepped out of the car with his chest puffed out, tossing the keys to the boy with a dismissive flick of his wrist. He didn't see the boy's eyes flicker toward me for a microsecond, a silent question in his gaze, before I gave a nearly imperceptible shake of my head. Janet and Lily were already there, standing under the custom bronze awning like 2 vultures in designer plumage. "Look at this place," Lily whispered, her eyes darting around the exterior, looking for a flaw to pick at. "Terribly ostentatious, isn't it?" It tries too hard to be old world. Probably owned by some tech brat with more money than taste. Now Lily, Janet said, though her tone was equally acidic. Give it a chance. Though I must say, Pamela, this might be a bit overwhelming for you. The menu is quite sophisticated. All French techniques. Don't feel pressured to understand everything. Mike can order for the table. I smiled, and for the first time it didn't feel like a mask. It felt like a baring of teeth. I'll try to keep up, Janet. We walked through the heavy, sound-dampened doors and the world changed. The scent of the restaurant, sandalwood, expensive wine, and the faint, savory aroma of truffle wrapped around me like a familiar cloak. This was my sanctum. I knew the exact wattage of the recessed lighting. I knew that the marble of the host's stand had been imported from a specific quarry in Carrara, because the veining looked like lightning. The hostess, a woman I had trained to be the epitome of cool grace, smiled at us. Reservation for Sterling? Yes, Mike Sterling, Mike said, leaning against the stand with an air of ownership that made my skin crawl. I believe we're at the corner booth? I requested the best view of the floor. Of course, sir. Right this way. As we walked through the dining room, I felt the eyes of my staff on me. It was a dizzying, surreal experience. They saw their employer, the woman who had demanded excellence and paid them a living wage when no one else would, being led like a lost child by a man who treated her like a burden. We were seated at the prime table. The table I had designed for high-stakes deals and whispered confessions. Well, Lily said, snapping her linen napkin open with an aggressive flourish. It's a bit dark, isn't it? Trying to hide the dust, I imagine. She ran a finger along the edge of the table that was polished every hour on the hour. She found nothing, of course, but she made a face as if she had. So Mike, Janet began, ignoring me entirely as she perused the wine list. Tell us about that new venture. Your father mentioned you're looking for new office space? Somewhere prestigious. I am, Mike said, his voice booming slightly too loud for the intimate space. I've got my eye on the new development across the park. It's expensive, but image is everything. You have to look like success to attract success. He glanced at me, a brief, pitying smile. Unlike Pam here, who thinks success is a well-organized pantry. Lily let out a sharp, mocking titter. To be fair, Mike, someone has to handle the mundane things while you're out making history. It's just a shame she doesn't have anything of her own to talk about. Don't you ever get bored, Pamela? Just waiting for Mike to come home and tell you what the world is like. I looked at her, my gaze steady, my heart beating a slow, rhythmic drum. I looked at the waiter approaching our table. A man who knew my favorite vintage, who knew that I hated the smell of lilies but loved the scent of rain. I looked at the bill folder tucked under his arm, the leather embossed with the logo I had sketched on a napkin in a cold guest room at 3 a.m. Oh, I find ways to keep myself busy, Lily, I said, my voice dropping an octave, gaining a weight that made Mike's head tilt in confusion. You'd be surprised how much you can build when everyone assumes you're just existing. The tension in the air was no longer a simmer. It was a rolling boil. I was stepping into my own trap, but for the first time in my life I wasn't the prey. I was the architect of the cage, and the door was about to lock. The atmosphere at the table was not merely tense, it was claustrophobic. Despite the high ceilings of Leritage and the meticulously calculated airflow I had insisted upon during construction, I felt as though the oxygen was being sucked out of the room, replaced by the cloying scent of Janet's expensive perfume and the sharp, acidic tang of Lily's malice. The first course arrived, a delicate lobster bisque with saffron foam. I watched as the server, a young woman named Lorena who I had personally mentored through a difficult first month, placed the bowls with trembling precision. She caught my eye for a fraction of a second, her expression flickering with a confused, protective concern. I gave her a microscopic nod, a silent command to remain a ghost. I must say, Janet began, blowing gently on a silver spoon, her eyes scanning the dining room like a general surveying a battlefield for flaws. The decor is interesting. A bit industrial for my taste, but I suppose it appeals to the nouveau riche. It's a shame they couldn't find a more established designer. It lacks the heritage its name suggests. I felt the first sharp pang in my jaw as I clenched my teeth. I had spent 4 months sourcing the reclaimed wood from a 19th century French winery for the floor. I had debated the exact Kelvin temperature of the light bulbs, so that the wine in the glasses would glow like liquid rubies. "Oh, Mother, you can't expect everyone to have your refined eye," Lily chimed in, her voice a melodic shrapnel. She turned her gaze to me, her smile not reaching her eyes. It never did. "What do you think of the place, Pamela? Or is this all a bit too high concept for someone who considers a trip to the local nursery the highlight of her week?" I took a slow, deliberate sip of the water. I didn't look at her. If I looked at her, the fire in my gut might spill out of my eyes. "The lighting is quite effective," I said, my voice a thin, fragile reed. "It creates a certain intimacy." Lily laughed, a short, sharp sound that cut through the low hum of the restaurant. "Intimacy? How quaint. You always focus on the small things, don't you? The domestic comforts. It's sweet, really. While Mike is out there literally reshaping the city's skyline, you're worried about the vibe of a room." "Lily, leave her be," Mike said, but the words carried no weight. He wasn't defending me. He was merely managing the noise level. He turned to me and there it was, the look. That devastating, pitying crinkle at the corners of his eyes, the slight tilt of the head that said, "I'm sorry they're like this, but you know how they are. Just take it for my sake." That look hurt more than Lily's barbs. It was the look of a man who viewed his wife as a wounded bird he had kindly allowed to nest in his attic. It was the look of a man who had no idea he was sitting in the shadow of my wings. "It's a good thing Mike is so successful," Janet continued, her tone shifting to that of a solemn high priestess praising a deity. "In this economy, a woman like you, Pamela, well, you're very lucky. You've never had to know the soul-crushing weight of a true professional responsibility. To have a man who provides everything, who shields you from the harshness of the real world, it's a rare gift." The real world. I bit my tongue. I bit it so hard that I tasted the sudden sharp metallic tang of blood. The copper flavor flooded my mouth, a visceral reminder of the truth I was suffocating. The real world was the 3 a.m. crisis 6 months ago when a pipe burst in this very kitchen and I stood knee-deep in freezing water, helping the plumber so we wouldn't miss our inspection. The real world was the brutal negotiations I'd held with the city's most corrupt union reps to ensure my staff got fair wages without the project being shut down. The real world was the millions of dollars currently moving through accounts Janet couldn't even fathom, all under a name she thought was quaint. "Mike has always been the pillar of this family," Lily added, swirling her vintage burgundy with a practiced haughty grace. "I honestly don't know what you'd do without him. You'd probably drift away like a dandelion clock. No direction, no drive. Just waiting for someone to tell you where to land." "I think Pamela understands her role, Lily," Mike said, his voice dropping into that deep, authoritative register he used in boardrooms. He reached over and patted my hand. His skin felt like lead. "She takes care of the home. She keeps things steady while I'm in the trenches. It's a partnership in its own way." "A partnership?" Lily scoffed. "Mike, don't be absurd. A partnership implies equal contribution. You provide the life, she provides the... well, she provides the presence at the dinner table. Let's call a spade a spade." I looked down at my plate. The saffron foam was collapsing, turning into a yellow puddle. I felt a strange, cold calm begin to settle over me. The pain in my tongue was receding, replaced by a numbness that felt like power. "You're right, Lily," I said softly. The table went silent. Mike looked at me, surprised by my sudden compliance. Janet's eyebrows arched toward her hairline. "I am lucky," I continued, my voice gaining a strange, crystalline clarity. "I am lucky to be surrounded by people who are so certain of their own importance that they never bother to look at anyone else. It must be very peaceful to live in a world where you already have all the answers." Lily's eyes narrowed. "What is that supposed to mean?" "It means," I said, finally looking her directly in the eye, "that you've spent the last 20 minutes talking about Mike's success as if it were a shield he built to protect a helpless child. But shields are heavy, Lily. And sometimes the person you think is hiding behind them is actually the one holding them up." Janet let out a dry, rattling cough. "Pamela, dear, the wine is clearly going to your head. You're becoming theatrical." "I haven't touched my wine, Janet," I replied, my gaze shifting to my mother-in-law. The waiter approached again to clear the first course. It was Marcus this time, my general manager. He looked at the table, at the sneering Lily, the dismissive Janet, and the oblivious Mike, and then he looked at me. His jaw was set, his eyes burning with an indignation I had forbidden him to show. "Is everything to your satisfaction, ma'am?" Marcus asked. He addressed me, but his eyes swept the entire table with a chilling professionalism. "The bisque was excellent, Marcus," I said, my voice steady. "But I think the table is ready for something a bit more substantial. Don't you agree, Mike?" Mike chuckled, entirely missing the subtext. "Absolutely. Bring on the main event. I've heard the Wagyu here is life-changing." "Of course, sir," Marcus said, bowing slightly. As he turned away, he caught my eye once more. I saw the question in his gaze. "How much longer, ma'am?" I didn't answer. I just watched him walk away. The atmosphere had shifted from suffocating to electric. The air felt charged, as if a storm were hovering just inches above the white linen tablecloth. I could feel the weight of the bill in the waiter's station, the leather folder that held the destruction of their illusions. I was done biting my tongue. The metallic taste of blood was gone, replaced by the cold, sharp taste of the coming winter. They wanted a show? I was about to give them a masterpiece. "You know," Lily said, leaning back and looking at the ceiling, "I think I've figured it out. This place is owned by a woman. It has that desperate need to prove itself, that frantic attention to detail that only someone with nothing else going on would obsess over." I smiled. It was a small, terrifying thing. "You have a very keen intuition, Lily. It's almost a gift. Enjoy the Wagyu, everyone," I added, picking up my knife. "I have a feeling this is a dinner none of us will ever forget." The main course had been cleared, leaving behind only the ghost of expensive fats and the lingering, heady aroma of truffle oil. The table felt like an altar, and we were the participants in a ritual that had been playing out for years, though tonight the air was charged with a static electricity that made the fine hairs on my arms stand on end. Lily stood up. She did so with a choreographed elegance, her silk dress shimmering like oil on water. She tapped her dessert spoon against her crystal glass, the sound sharp and crystalline, demanding the attention of the surrounding tables. She wanted witnesses. This wasn't just a family dinner. It was a public coronation of her brother and, by extension, a public shaming of the woman sitting beside him. "If I could have everyone's attention for just a moment," she began, her voice carrying that practiced, effortless projection of the elite. She didn't look at me. She looked at Mike, her eyes glowing with a fervor that bordered on the religious. "I want to propose a toast to my brother. To Mike." Mike leaned back, his chest expanding, a humble yet triumphant smile playing on his lips. He looked every bit the conqueror, the sun around which we all in their minds were forced to orbit. "Mike, you have had a year that most men only dream of," Lily continued, her glass raised high. "You've navigated the complexities of this city, built your firm into a powerhouse, and remained the singular pillar of strength for this family. It's rare to see such unilateral success. To do it all on your own, to carry the weight of everyone's expectations and never falter. It's nothing short of extraordinary." She paused, her gaze finally flickering toward me, a brief, cold spark of triumph. "And to Pamela, for being the perfect spectator, for staying in the wings while Mike took center stage. Every great man needs a quiet room to return to, and you, Pamela, have made a career out of being that quiet room." "To Mike! To Mike!" Janet echoed, her voice a sharp, brittle chime. Mike beamed, clinking his glass against theirs. He turned to me, his eyes softened by that unbearable pity again. He reached over, squeezing my hand, a gesture that felt like a collar. "Thanks, Lil. And thanks, Pam. I know it hasn't always been easy being married to my schedule, but you've played your part well." "Played my part." The words were the final nail. I didn't drink. I set my glass down on the white linen, the base of the crystal clicking with a finality that only I seemed to hear. I felt a strange, cold peace wash over me. The quiet room they spoke of was about to be hit by a hurricane. It was then that I saw Marcus. He emerged from the shadows of the service station, his movements fluid and deliberate. He wasn't carrying a tray of digestives or a plate of petit fours. He was carrying a single dark leather folder, the bill. But to me it looked like a weapon. I watched him in what felt like slow motion. The way the light from the hand-blown chandeliers caught the silver pins on his lapel. The way the other diners blurred into a hazy background of clinking silverware and low murmurs. Marcus walked with a purpose that made the air around him seem to part. As he approached our table, Mike did what he always did. He didn't even look up from his conversation with Janet. He simply extended his hand, palm up, fingers twitching in a silent demand for the check. It was a gesture of absolute unthinking authority. He was the provider. He was the one with the credit card that never declined. He was the man of the hour. "I'll take that, Marcus," Mike said, his voice casual, dismissive. But Marcus didn't stop at Mike's hand. He didn't even glance at the outstretched fingers that had expected to receive the folder. In a move that felt like a tectonic shift, Marcus bypassed Mike entirely. He stepped around the head of the table, his eyes fixed on mine with a depth of respect that I hadn't seen from a man in a decade. He leaned down, his posture perfect, and with a graceful, silent flourish, he placed the leather folder directly in front of me. "The bill, ma'am," Marcus said. His voice wasn't loud, but in the sudden jarring vacuum of the table's conversation, it sounded like a thunderclap. The silence that followed was not merely quiet. It was a physical entity, thick, suffocating, and heavy enough to crush the lungs. Mike's hand remained frozen in midair. A pathetic, empty claw. He blinked, his brow furrowing in a slow-motion dance of confusion. Janet's glass stopped halfway to her lips, her eyes widening behind her designer frames. Lily, who had been mid-laugh, looked as if she had been turned to stone, her mouth slightly agape, the triumph on her face curdling into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. "Wait," Mike stammered, his voice cracking, losing its polished edge. There's a mistake. Marcus. I'm the one paying. Give it here." He reached for the folder on my side of the table, his movements frantic, desperate to restore the order of his world. But I didn't let him. I placed my hand firmly on top of the leather folder. The cool, pebbled texture of the skin felt like the hilt of a sword. I looked at Mike, and for the first time in our marriage I didn't look at him with love or patience or even anger. I looked at him with the cold, detached clarity of a stranger. "There's no mistake, Mike," I said. My voice was low, vibrating with a power that made the crystal on the table hum. "Pamela, don't be ridiculous," Janet snapped, though her voice lacked its usual bite. She was trembling. "This is Mike's dinner. Put that down. You're making a scene." "Am I?" I asked, tilting my head. I looked at Lily, whose face was rapidly draining of color. "Lily, you just toasted to Mike's unilateral success. You talked about how I've made a career out of being a quiet room. You talked about heritage and class and who belongs in a place like this." I slowly opened the folder. I didn't need to look at the total. I knew exactly what was there. Just as I knew the serial numbers of the ovens in the kitchen and the names of the children of the man who polished these floors. "The thing about heritage, Lily," I said, my gaze boring into hers until she flinched, "is that it isn't always something you're born into. Sometimes, it's something you build in the dark while everyone else is sleeping." I looked back at Marcus. "Thank you, Marcus. Please inform the kitchen that the Wagyu was slightly oversalted tonight. Only by a fraction, but we strive for perfection, don't we?" "Of course, ma'am," Marcus replied, a faint, knowing smile touching his lips. "I'll inform the chef immediately." He bowed, not to the table but to me, and stepped back into the shadows. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was no longer the silence of shock. It was the silence of a collapsing building. The mask of the Sterling family had fallen, and beneath it was nothing but the hollow, terrified eyes of people who had realized too late that the person they had been mocking was the only reason they were allowed in the room. "Pam!" Mike whispered, his face pale, his eyes searching mine as if seeing me for the very first time. What is this?" I didn't answer him yet. I let the silence choke the room just a moment longer. I let them feel the weight of every insult, every dismissive glance, and every pitying smile they had ever given me. The invisible wife was gone. The owner had arrived. The silence that followed Marcus's departure was more than an absence of sound. It was a physical weight, a tectonic shift that had suddenly knocked the equilibrium of our world off its axis. I could feel the eyes of the entire room, or perhaps it was just the intensity of the three people sitting across from me, boring into the leather folder that sat beneath my palm. It was no longer just a bill for a meal. It was a manifesto of my hidden life. Mike's hand still suspended in that pathetic, expectant claw finally dropped. It hit the table with a soft thud that sounded like a gavel. He looked at the folder, then at me, then back at the folder. His face was a chaotic map of confusion, searching for a logical explanation that didn't involve his worldview being set on fire. "Pamela," he said, his voice a jagged whisper, a far cry from the booming, confident baritone he had used to toast his own success moments ago. "What are you doing? This isn't funny. You're embarrassing yourself. And us. Give me the check." I didn't move my hand. I felt the cool, polished marble of the table beneath the tablecloth, a foundation I had paid for with the currency of my own sweat and silence. I looked at Janet. The blood hadn't just left her face. It had retreated as if terrified of the woman I was becoming. Her skin, usually the color of expensive cream, was now the shade of ash. Her mouth, which had spent years crafting insults disguised as advice, was pulled into a thin, trembling line. "Mike is right," Janet managed to say, though the authority in her voice had been replaced by a brittle, frantic edge. "This is quite enough. I know you felt overlooked tonight, but this little performance is beneath a sterling wife. Take your hand off the bill and let Mike handle the business. It's what he's for." I looked at her, and for the first time I didn't feel the need to shrink. I didn't feel the familiar urge to apologize for occupying space. I felt a surge of something intoxicating, a raw, visceral power that had been brewing in the dark for a decade. It was the feeling of a predator finally stepping out of the tall grass. "You've all spent so much time telling me what I am," I said, my voice cutting through the air like a gently sharpened blade. It was calm, devoid of the tremors that usually plagued my speech during these dinners. "You've called me a spectator, a quiet room, a piece of scenery. You've talked about Mike's unilateral success as if I were a ghost haunting the house he built." I leaned forward, the motion slow and deliberate, until I was looking directly into Mike's wide, uncomprehending eyes. He looked at me as if I had suddenly begun to speak a dead, celestial language, something he recognized as speech but could never hope to translate. He didn't know this woman. He didn't know the tilt of my chin or the cold iron in my gaze. "The truth is," I said, the 5 words forming on my tongue with the weight of a mountain, "you're only sitting at this table because I allow it." I paused, letting the statement hang in the air, a precursor to the killing blow. "Actually, I own this place." The words didn't just shatter their reality, they pulverized it. The sound of Lily's sharp intake of breath was the only thing that broke the ensuing stillness. Her mouth fell open, truly physically agape, an expression that stripped away every ounce of her practiced haughty grace. She looked at me, then at the logo on the bill, then at the staff who were standing at a respectful distance, their eyes fixed on me with a loyalty she could never purchase. "You what?" Lily stammered, her voice rising an octave. That's impossible. You don't even have a job, Pamela. You spend your days at the garden center. You're Mike's wife." "I am Mike's wife," I conceded, my voice as cold as the ice in the bucket beside us. "But I am also the majority shareholder of the holding company that owns this restaurant, the building it stands in, and the 3 storefronts you passed on your way here, Lily. I didn't get these things through connections or heritage. I built them while you were busy mocking my lack of ambition over your 3rd mimosa." Janet gripped the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned white, her pearls rattling against her chest. She looked like she was about to faint or scream. "Mike," she hissed, "tell her to stop. Tell her this is a lie. How could she own this?" But Mike couldn't tell me anything. He was drowning in the realization that his entire perception of our marriage, the power dynamic he had relied on to feel superior, was a fiction. He looked at me, and I saw the moment the mask of the prodigy crumbled. He wasn't the sole provider. He wasn't the son. He was a man who had been so blinded by his own reflection that he hadn't noticed his wife building a galaxy right beside him. "Pam," he whispered, his eyes searching mine for a trace of the woman he thought he knew. Why wouldn't you tell me?" "Because you didn't want to know, Mike," I said, and the sadness in my voice was the only thing that remained of the old Pamela. "You needed me to be small so you could feel big. You needed a quiet room because you couldn't handle the noise of an equal. You never asked about my days because you assumed they were empty. You didn't tell me about your deals because you assumed I wouldn't understand. I didn't lie to you. I just stopped trying to be heard by someone who wasn't listening. The intoxicating power of finally being seen was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't just the thrill of the reveal. It was the reclamation of my own skin. I felt the invisible threads that had bound me to their expectations snap one by one. I was no longer the stay-at-home wife they could patronize. I was the architect of the floor they were standing on, the provider of the meal they had just consumed, and the master of the silence that was currently crushing their egos. I opened the folder. I pulled out a black card, my card embossed with my name, not Mike's. I placed it on top of the bill with a sharp clack. "This dinner is on me," I said, looking at Janet and Lily. "Consider it a gift. A thank you for all the years of insults. They were the fuel I used to build this empire. Every time you called me a nobody, I bought another asset. Every time you mocked my simple life, I secured another contract." I stood up, the movement fluid and regal. I didn't wait for them to respond. I didn't need their apologies, and I certainly didn't need their validation. The killing blow had been delivered, and the Sterlings were left bleeding in the wreckage of their own arrogance. "I have some business to attend to in the back," I said, smoothing my dress. "Marcus will see you out. Mike, I'll see you at home. Or perhaps I won't. I haven't decided yet." As I turned to walk away, I felt the eyes of the entire restaurant on me. For years I had walked through life as a shadow. Tonight I was the light. And as the blood continued to drain from their faces, I realized that the echo of my small beginnings had finally grown into a roar that would never be silenced again. I walked toward the kitchen, my heels clicking a rhythm of victory against the wood floor. I was the owner. I was the titan. And for the first time in a decade, I was Pamela. The air in the room didn't just grow still. It became stagnant, heavy with the weight of things unsaid for a decade. As I stood there looking down at the three people who had comprised the borders of my world, I didn't feel the rush of adrenaline I had expected. Instead, I felt a profound, ice-cold clarity. I was no longer viewing them through the lens of a wife or a daughter-in-law. I was viewing them as a creditor who had finally come to collect on a debt that had been compounding for years. "You're not shocked because you're proud of me," I said, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the restaurant I had willed into existence. "You're shocked because the hierarchy you spent years constructing just collapsed. You're terrified, aren't you? Terrified that the woman you used as a footstool is actually the one who owns the floor." Janet's hand went to her throat, her fingers clutching those omnipresent pearls as if they were a life preserver. "Pamela, that is an incredibly cruel thing to say. We've always supported you in our own way." "In your own way?" I let out a short, hollow laugh that felt like a serrated blade. "Let's look at the ledger, Janet. Let's talk about the sacrifices I made at the altar of your support. Because I've been keeping a tally. Every time you spoke about my humble background as if it were a disease I had luckily recovered from. Every time you corrected my manners as if I were a stray dog you had brought in from the rain." I turned my gaze to Lily. Her eyes were darting toward the other patrons, her social reflex still trying to calculate the damage to her reputation even as her world crumbled. "And you, Lily," I said, stepping closer to the table. 2 years ago at Mike's birthday gala. "Do you remember what you whispered to your friends when you thought I was out of earshot? You called me a financial anchor. You said I was a burden Mike had to carry because he was too noble to leave his college sweetheart behind. You laughed about how I had no drive, no spark, nothing but a pretty face that was starting to fade from the stress of doing nothing." Lily's mouth worked, but no sound came out. The vitriol she usually wielded so effortlessly had turned to ash in her mouth. "I stood 3 feet away behind a floral arrangement," I continued, the memory as vivid as a fresh burn. "I listened to every word. And do you know what the most painful part was? It wasn't your cruelty, Lily. I expected that from you. It was the silence that followed." I finally looked at Mike. He was staring at the table, his shoulders hunched, the titan of industry reduced to a boy caught in a lie. "You were there, Mike," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried more weight than a scream. "You heard her. You heard your sister call your wife a burden, a parasite on your success. And you didn't say a word. You just sipped your scotch and nodded, as if her words were a regrettable but undeniable truth. Your silence wasn't peace, Mike. It was complicity. It was the loudest thing I've ever heard." I thought I was protecting you by not making a scene, Mike stammered, finally looking up. His eyes were red-rimmed, searching mine for a mercy I no longer possessed. I didn't think it mattered. I knew you were more than that. Did you? I asked, tilting my head. Because for 10 years you treated me exactly like they did. You gave me that pitying look, the one you gave me tonight every time they belittled me. You patted my hand and told me to let it go, while you went on to build a life where I was a secondary character. You didn't protect me, Mike. You curated me. You kept me in a box marked domestic peace, and never bothered to check if I was suffocating inside. The rage I had suppressed for so long wasn't a fire, it was a flood. It was the thousands of hours I had spent working in the dark, the secret meetings, the grueling labor of building an empire while pretending to be a non-entity. I had sacrificed my identity, my pride, and my voice to keep his world balanced. I built this restaurant and everything else you're about to discover, because I needed a place where your family's voice couldn't reach me, I said, gesturing to the elegant, bustling room. I needed to know that if I lost everything, if I walked away from the sterling name tomorrow, I would still be a titan. I became a ghost in my own home because it was the only way to become a queen in the real world. I looked at the three of them, the successful sterlings. For the first time I saw them for what they were: small. They were people who defined their worth by who they could look down upon. And now that they couldn't look down on me, they had no idea who they were. This is the ledger of sacrifices, I said, my hand sweeping across the table, nearly knocking over Lily's half-empty glass of wine. I sacrificed my youth to your expectations. I sacrificed my confidence to your mockery. And I sacrificed the truth of my marriage to your ego. But the debt is paid. The account is closed. Janet finally found her voice, though it was thin and reedy. So what now? You've humiliated us. You've had your little moment of revenge. Are you satisfied? I looked at her, and the cold clarity reached its peak. Satisfaction has nothing to do with it, Janet. It's about equilibrium. For years you've enjoyed a life funded, in part, by the very lack of ambition you mocked. My holding company holds the debt on your summer home. I'm the silent partner in the firm Mike is trying to merge with. I didn't just build a restaurant. I built a net. And you've all been resting in it while calling me a failure. The shock on their faces wasn't pride. It wasn't the realization of my talent. It was the pure, unadulterated fear of losing their perceived superiority. If I was the provider, they were the dependents. If I was the success, they were the spectators. I'm going to the office, I said, my voice now devoid of all emotion. Marcus will bring the car around for you. Mike, don't wait up. I have a lot of work to do, and for the first time in 10 years, I don't have to pretend that I don't. I turned my back on them. The silence that followed was the sound of a legacy crumbling. I walked away, my heels clicking against the floor. Each step a period at the end of a long, painful sentence. I had been their punching bag for a decade, but tonight, I was the one who had landed the final blow. And it felt better than any peace I had ever bartered for. I stepped into the kitchen, the heat and noise of the line rising to meet me like a familiar embrace. Here I wasn't a sterling. I wasn't a burden. I was the boss. And as I looked at the order rail, I realized that while I had lost a family of shadows, I had finally found myself in the light. The hallway behind the main dining room was a transitional space, a narrow artery of polished concrete and dim, recessed lighting that separated the theater of the front of house from the chaotic, searing reality of the kitchen. It was cool here, the air smelling of ozone and floor wax, a stark contrast to the scent of truffle and desperation that still clung to my skin from the table. I heard his footsteps before I heard his voice. They were heavy, uneven, the footsteps of a man who had suddenly lost his peripheral vision. Pamela! Stop. Just stop for a second. I turned. Mike looked smaller in the shadows of the hallway. The expensive tailoring of his suit, which usually made him look like a fortress, now seemed to hang off him, redundant. His face was a map of fractured pride. He didn't look like a titan. He looked like a man who had walked into his own home and found the furniture rearranged by a ghost. Why did you lie to me? He asked, his voice cracking on the final word. It wasn't an accusation. It was a plea for a reality where he wasn't the fool. For years, Pam, you let me believe. You let everyone believe you were just staying at home. You lied by every word you didn't say. How could you keep a whole life, a whole empire, secret from your own husband? I leaned back against the cool wall, crossing my arms. I felt a strange, detached pity for him, the way one might feel for an actor who realized mid-play that he was on the wrong stage. I never lied to you, Mike, I said, my voice sounding unnervingly steady in the confined space. A lie requires an effort to deceive. I didn't have to make an effort. I simply stopped offering information that you had already signaled was of no value to you. That's semantics and you know it, he snapped, stepping closer, his hands gesturing wildly. You own buildings. You signed contracts. You were building a rival world while I was out there working for our future. You let me pay for everything. You let me feel like I was taking care of you. And you loved that feeling, didn't you? I countered, my voice dropping an octave, becoming a cold, sharp instrument. You loved the weight of being the provider. It was your favorite costume. But don't you see the irony, Mike? You didn't pay for everything. You paid for the facade. You paid for the silk dresses and the marble foyer because they reflected your success back at you. You didn't notice that my bank accounts were growing because you never bothered to look past the woman who greeted you at the door with a smile. I looked at you every day. No, I said, shaking my head. You looked at me, but you never looked for me. Did you ever ask why I was up at 4 in the morning? Did you ever wonder why I knew so much about the commercial zoning on the South Side? Did you ever ask me, even once, what I dreamed about when I wasn't dreaming about you? The silence that followed was a jagged thing. Mike's eyes flickered, searching his memory for a moment of genuine curiosity that wasn't there. He found nothing but the empty corridors of his own self-absorption. You were complicit, Mike, I continued, the truth spilling out now like water from a burst pipe. You were complicit in Janet and Lily's disdain. Every time Lily called me a burden or a pretty ornament, and you stayed silent or worse, gave me that pitying look, it wasn't because you were being a peacemaker. It was because her insults validated your hero complex. If I was the helpless, ambitionless wife, then you were the noble, successful husband who stayed with her despite her flaws. My weakness was the scaffolding for your strength. Mike flinched as if I had struck him. He opened his mouth to defend himself, but the words died in his throat. The realization was beginning to take root in his eyes. The marriage he thought he had was a ghost, a hollow shell he had decorated with his own ego. You let them treat me like a nobody because it made you the only somebody, I said, stepping toward him until we were inches apart. I didn't hide my success to hurt you, Mike. I hid it to protect it. I knew that the moment you found out I was your equal, or God forbid, your superior in the market, you wouldn't be proud. You would be threatened. You would find a way to make my wins yours, or you would belittle them until they felt as small as you wanted me to be. That's not true, he whispered, but there was no conviction in it. He was looking at me, really looking at me, and he was seeing a stranger who knew his darkest secrets. It is true. Look at your face right now. You aren't happy that your wife is a success. You aren't relieved that our financial future is more secure than you ever imagined. You're angry because the power dynamic has shifted, and you don't know how to stand on level ground. You only know how to look down. I reached out and adjusted his tie, a domestic gesture that felt violent in its intimacy. Our marriage wasn't a partnership, Mike. It was a performance. I was the supporting actress who decided to write her own script, while you were busy admiring your name on the marquee. Where does this leave us, Pam? He asked, his voice hollow. If the foundation is gone, what's left? I looked at him, and for a fleeting second, I saw the ghost of the man I had married in college, the one who had promised to conquer the world with me, not for me. But that man had been swallowed by the sterling legacy long ago. The foundation didn't just disappear tonight, Mike. It's been eroding for years, one silent dinner and one dismissive comment at a time. Tonight was just the moment the house finally fell. I turned away from him, walking toward the door that led to the office. I didn't lie, Mike, I said over my shoulder. I just grew up. It's a shame you were too busy being a hero to notice. As the door clicked shut behind me, I stood in the quiet of my office, my heart hammering a slow, heavy rhythm. The confrontation hadn't brought the relief I expected. Instead, it brought a profound sense of mourning. I was mourning the woman who had waited for him to see her, and I was mourning the man who had been too blind to look. The marriage was a ghost, and ghosts, I realized, don't need homes. They just need to be laid to rest. I sat down at my desk and opened my laptop. There were contracts to sign, emails to send, and a future to build that didn't require a hero. The echo of the small-town girl was gone. In its place was the steady, unwavering hum of a woman who had finally stepped out of the shadow and realized she was the one casting it. The air in the private lounge of Leritage felt different, thinner perhaps, or perhaps it was just that the pretenses had finally been bled out of the room. I had led them here, away from the prying eyes of the main dining floor, to a space that was my inner sanctum. It was a room of dark walnut, deep emerald velvet, and a wall of monitors that usually displayed the silent, flickering pulse of my various ventures. Mike, Janet, and Lily stood like intruders in a museum. They looked at the art on the walls, pieces they had probably seen in magazines, and wondered who was sophisticated enough to buy. And they didn't realize they were looking at my personal collection. "You think this is about a restaurant?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried the force of a landslide. I walked over to the mahogany desk and tapped a sequence into the integrated tablet. The large central screen on the wall hummed to life, shedding its decorative digital art for a cold geometric display of corporate structures. "You think I did this to prove I could run a kitchen? You think this was a vanity project to occupy my empty afternoons?" I turned to look at them. Janet was pale, her hand still hovering near her throat. Lily looked like she wanted to vomit or scream, her social armor lying in jagged pieces at her feet. Mike just looked exhausted, the weight of the hero role finally crushing his spine. "This," I said, gesturing to the screen, "is Vesper Global. It's a shell company, Mike. You've seen the name in the journals. You've even complained about how Vesper was aggressively outbidding your firm on the West End developments." Mike's eyes went wide. The color drained from his lips. "Vesper? That's you? We lost the warehouse district project to Vesper. We lost the maritime contract to Vesper. You were the one bleeding us dry." "I wasn't bleeding you dry, Mike," I corrected him, my heart feeling like a cold stone in my chest. "I was winning. There is a difference. While you were taking your father's advice and playing by the old boy rules, I was leveraging assets you didn't even know existed. I wasn't your rival, I was the weather. I was the environment you were trying to survive in." I scrolled the screen. A map of the city appeared, dotted with crimson markers. "These are the real estate holdings. The downtown lofts. The strip on 4th Street. The industrial park near the harbor. I own them through various subsidiaries. And this." I tapped a final icon. An architectural rendering of a sleek, obsidian and gold skyscraper appeared. It was the Onyx Hotel and Residences. The room went so quiet I could hear the hum of the air conditioning. This was the project the city had been whispering about for 18 months. It was the crowning jewel of the new skyline. A project so exclusive that Mike's father had spent 3 months trying to secure even a minor consulting role for Mike's firm, only to be rejected without explanation. "The Onyx," Lily whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of awe and pure, unadulterated hatred. "You're the developer? You're the invisible mogul the papers keep talking about." "The nobody," I said, the word tasting like iron. "The stay-at-home wife with no drive. The woman who was just scenery for your brother's life." "I didn't just build a restaurant, Lily. I built the very world you've been trying to climb into." The emotional weight of the moment began to press down on me, but it wasn't a burden. It was an anchor. I realized then that for years I hadn't just been building an empire to escape them. I had been building a cage to keep them safe. "But here is the part that really matters," I said, my voice hardening. I opened a folder labeled Sterling Trust. "Janet, your summer estate in the Hamptons? The one you boast about every Christmas? The mortgage was sold 3 years ago to a private equity firm. That firm is a subsidiary of Vesper. I didn't buy it to evict you. I bought it because your husband's legacy investments were failing, and you were weeks away from a foreclosure that would have destroyed the Sterling name." Janet gasped, her knees buckling. She grabbed the back of a velvet chair to keep from falling. You've been paying for my home?" "And Lily," I said, turning to the woman who had called me an anchor. "Your boutique? The one that proves you're a businesswoman? You've never turned a profit, Lily. Not once. You've been stayed afloat by anonymous grants and low-interest loans that never seem to be called in. Who do you think signed those checks? Who do you think made sure your vanity project didn't end in a public bankruptcy? Lily's face twisted into a mask of agony. The realization that her independence was a gift from the woman she despised was a humiliation deeper than any I could have spoken. And Mike, I said, finally looking at my husband, your firm, that lucky break you got last quarter? The one that saved your partnership? That was an infusion of capital from an angel investor. Me. I've been holding the safety net for this entire family, while you all stood on it and spit on me. The silence that followed was the most honest moment we had ever shared. It was the realization of a total lopsided asymmetry of power. I was no longer just his wife, I was his benefactor. I was the silent engine that kept the Sterling machine from grinding to a halt. Why? Mike asked, his voice broken. If you hated us this much, if you felt this belittled, why save us? Why not let us fall? I looked at him, and for the first time, I felt the cold clarity turn into a quiet, aching sorrow. Because I loved you, Mike. And because I came from a place where we take care of our own, even when they don't deserve it. I didn't want to see you fail. I wanted to see you see me. I thought if I kept the world from crashing down on you, you might eventually have the time to look at the woman standing next to you. I closed the laptop, the screen going black, taking the glowing empire with it. But tonight I realized that you were never going to look. You were too busy admiring the safety net to notice the person holding the ropes. You treated me like a nobody, and in doing so you became the very thing you feared. A parasite on a success you couldn't comprehend. The celebration was over. The masks were gone. And as I looked at the three of them, shrunken, terrified, and utterly dependent on the woman they had mocked, I realized that I had finally won. But the victory didn't feel like a crown. Felt like a divorce. Not just from Mike, but from the lie I had been living to keep their egos intact. I'm done holding the ropes, I said, my voice echoing in the walnut-paneled room. Tomorrow Vesper Global begins the process of divesting from all Sterling-related assets. You have 30 days to find new investors, new loans, and a new identity. I'm moving my office to the Onyx. Don't come looking for me. I walked past them, the scent of emerald velvet and power trailing behind me. I was the nobody who owned everything, and they were the somebodies who finally realized they had nothing at all. The aftermath of a landslide is often quieter than the crash itself. In the week following the dinner at Leritage, the Sterling world didn't explode. It simply began to deflate, the air hissing out of their social standing with a pathetic high-pitched whine. I sat in my new office on the top floor of the Onyx. It was a space of glass and steel, suspended above the city like a hawk's nest. From here the world looked organized, logical, and entirely within my control. My phone had been ringing incessantly, calls from lawyers, calls from the press, and most frequently, calls from the very people who had once treated my presence like a stain on their silk upholstery. The first to arrive, unannounced and visibly trembling, was Janet. She didn't enter with her usual regal stride. The woman who once walked as if the ground were honored to meet her feet now shuffled. Her hair was perfect, her suit was Chanel, but the woman inside the clothes was hollow. The pedestal of the matriarch had developed a terminal crack. "Pamela, dear," she began, her voice fluttering like a trapped bird. She sat on the edge of my guest chair, her designer handbag clutched to her chest like a shield. I wanted to come by. To see this magnificent space. We always knew, you know. Deep down. I didn't look up from the contract I was reviewing. I let the silence stretch until it became an interrogation. "What did you know, Janet? That you had such a spark?" She pivoted, her face contorting into a terrifyingly artificial smile. "We always said to Mike, that Pamela, she's a dark horse. There's more to her than meets the eye. We were just waiting for you to feel comfortable enough to share your brilliance with us. We're so proud, truly. The Sterling family has always valued entrepreneurs." I finally set my pen down. The click of the metal against the glass desk sounded like a bone breaking. I looked at her, not with anger, but with a surgical detached curiosity. "Stop," I said. The word was a scalpel. "Don't insult my intelligence, Janet. It's the only thing in this room you can't afford." The smile died on her face, leaving behind a map of desperate wrinkles. "You didn't always know," I continued, leaning forward. "You spent 10 years trying to curate my extinction. You didn't see a dark horse. You saw a convenient scapegoat for your frustrations. You saw a girl from a small town you could mold into a servant who looked like a socialite. And now that you realize I am the one holding the keys to your summer home, and your husband's reputation, you want to rewrite history. Pamela, please, she whispered, her social mask finally disintegrating into a puddle of raw terror. The bank called this morning. They said Vesper Global has initiated a transfer of the lien. If you call in that debt, we lose everything. The reputation, the legacy. Mike's father couldn't survive the scandal. The legacy was a lie, Janet. It was built on the backs of people you deemed beneath you. It was built on my silence. I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. You don't respect me now. You're just afraid of me. And while that's a refreshing change of pace, don't confuse your fear for pride. You're here for a favor. You're here because you realize the person you mocked is the only person who can keep you from becoming a nobody yourself. Before she could respond, the door swished open. Lily marched in, her face a blotchy red. She wasn't trying to pivot. She was still in the anger phase of her grief. You can't do this, Lily shouted, ignoring her mother's frantic shushing. You're ruining our lives. My boutique. I got a notice that the rent is tripling. My suppliers are cutting me off because they heard Vesper is divesting. You're doing this on purpose. I'm not doing anything to you, Lily, I said, turning to face her. I am simply treating you with the same professional indifference you've shown me for a decade. I am removing the charity from your life. If your business can't survive a market rate rent, then it wasn't a business. It was a hobby funded by the woman you called a burden. We're family, Lily screamed, the irony of the statement thick enough to taste. Family? I asked, a cold laugh escaping my lips. Family doesn't whisper about financial anchors at galas. Family doesn't mock someone's origins to make themselves feel superior. You weren't a family to me, you were a cage. And now that the bird has outgrown the bars, you're upset that the cage is falling apart. The room fell into a heavy, uncomfortable silence. It was the birth of a new reality. For the first time, they weren't looking at me as Mike's wife. They were looking at me as a sovereign. Their ego, the belief that they were inherently better than me, was dead. In its place was a jagged, desperate need for my grace. Janet stood up, her movements slow and defeated. She looked at her daughter, then back at me. What do you want, Pamela? Just tell us what we have to do. I don't want your apologies, I said, returning to my desk. They're worthless because they're prompted by a checkbook, not a heart. I don't want your respect, because it's rooted in what I can do for you, not who I am. What I want is for you to leave. Go back to the world you built, and see if you can survive in it without my shadow to shield you. And the house? Janet asked, her voice trembling. The house stays with Vesper for now, I said, not looking up. I'll decide its fate when I decide yours. For now, consider yourselves on probation from the life you thought you earned. Every luxury you enjoy from this moment on is a gift from the nobody you despised. Remember that every time you look in the mirror. They left the office like ghosts. There was no snappy retort from Lily, no cutting remark from Janet. They walked out with their heads down, their pedestals reduced to rubble. I sat back, the silence of the onyx wrapping around me. The intoxicating power I had felt at the restaurant was gone, replaced by a somber, heavy realization. Their respect was hollow, born of necessity. But as I looked out over the city I was helping to build, I realized that I didn't need their respect to be whole. I had my own. The Sterlings were no longer the giants of my world. They were just small people in a very large building, waiting for a mercy they hadn't yet earned. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't in a hurry to give it to them. The dusk over the city was a violent bruise of purple and oxidized orange, casting long, sharp shadows across the floor of my office at the Onyx. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass, watching the grid of the streets below light up in a synchronized mechanical rhythm. Up here, insulated by 3 inches of soundproofed glass, the chaotic roar of the metropolis was reduced to a gentle, subservient hum. It was the perfect environment for an autopsy. When the heavy oak door of my office finally clicked open, I didn't immediately turn around. I let the silence stretch, forcing him to occupy the space on my terms. I listened to his footsteps. They were hesitant, lacking the heavy boots-on-the-ground certainty that had defined Mike Sterling for the entirety of our marriage. He didn't stride in like a conqueror claiming his territory. He stepped in like a trespasser expecting to trip an alarm. "You wanted to see me, Pam," he said. His voice was a hollow echo of the baritone that used to command boardrooms and silence family dinners. I turned slowly. He was standing near the doorway, his hands awkwardly shoved into the pockets of his slacks. The bespoke suit that usually acted as his armor now looked like a costume he had outgrown. He looked exhausted, the skin around his eyes bruised with sleeplessness and the terrifying realization of his own irrelevance. "Sit down, Mike," I said, gesturing to one of the Barcelona chairs opposite my desk. He moved to sit, but I remained standing, a deliberate physical manifestation of the new topography of our lives. I walked over to my desk and picked up a small matte black velvet box. It was unassuming, the kind of box that usually held a watch or a set of cufflinks. I walked around the desk and placed it on the glass table between us. The soft thump it made seemed to vibrate in the sterile air of the room. "What is this?" he asked, staring at the box as if it might detonate. "Open it." His hands trembled slightly as he reached forward. He popped the hidden hinge and the lid sprang back. Inside, resting on a bed of dark silk, was a single heavy key forged from brushed steel and edged in gold. Engraved on its face was the crest of the Onyx Hotel and Residences. Mike stared at it, his brow furrowing in that familiar, agonizingly slow attempt to process a reality that didn't center around his own ego. "The Onyx, you said. You said you owned this building. Why are you giving me a key?" "Pick it up, Mike," I instructed, my voice devoid of warmth, devoid of anger, devoid of anything but the cold, surgical truth. He lifted the key from the silk. His hand dipped slightly under its unexpected weight. It was solid, heavy, and undeniably real. 3 years ago, when the foundation for this building was poured, I had the corporate structuring drafted. I began, pacing slowly behind my desk. The holding company, Vesper Global, was the majority stakeholder. But there was a secondary partner, a managing director listed on the charter, endowed with 30% of the equity and full executive privileges. Mike's eyes snapped up to mine, a flicker of desperate, tragic hope igniting in his chest. "Me? You made me a partner." "I made you a figurehead," I corrected smoothly, extinguishing the spark before it could catch air. "I put the paperwork in your home study. I left the legal binders on your desk, right next to your scotch glass for 3 weeks. I mingled the initial escrow transfers with our joint accounts. I left a trail of breadcrumbs so wide and so glaringly obvious that a first-year accounting student would have tripped over them." The confusion on his face began to curdle into a sickening dread. He looked down at the key, then back at me. "It was a test, Mike," I said, the words falling like blocks of ice. "A test of your loyalty, your partnership, and your basic respect for the space we shared. All you had to do was look. All you had to do was read one document. Ask one question about why a multi-million-dollar land acquisition was crossing your desk with your wife's maiden name listed as the primary guarantor. If you had noticed, if you had come to me and said, 'Pamela, what is this?' I would have handed you half my empire. I would have built this skyline with you." Mike's breath hitched. His eyes darted frantically as his memory betrayed him, playing back the countless nights he had blindly shoved my paperwork aside to make room for his own important briefs. "But you didn't look," I continued, my voice dropping to a harsh, quiet register, "because it never occurred to you that anything in my hands could be of consequence. When the angel investment saved your firm, you didn't question the source. You told your father it was because of your brilliant pitching. When your firm was retained to handle the blind trust zoning for this very hotel, you bragged about your connections. You signed the documents I put in front of you because you assumed your simple wife was just having you look over her little gardening receipts. Pam." He choked out, the key slipping in his sweating palm. I was busy. I was trying to provide. You were trying to perform." I snapped, the sudden volume making him flinch. "You weren't providing, Mike. You were playing dress-up in a world I was quietly financing. You failed the test not because you were busy but because your ego required you to be blind. You needed me to be a nobody so desperately that you ignored millions of dollars passing through your own house." I stopped pacing and stood directly in front of him. I looked down at the man I had once loved, searching for the resentment that had fueled me for a decade. But it was gone. The anger had burned itself out, leaving only a cold, pristine ash. "You thought I was the accessory to your life," I said softly, the absolute honesty in my tone chilling the room. "You thought I was the pretty ornament you wore on your arm to galas, the quiet room you returned to when the real world tired you out. But look at this room, Mike. Look at this building. Look at the key in your hand." He looked down at the brushed steel. His hand was shaking so violently that the metal rattled against his wedding band. "You are the accessory, Mike," I whispered, the truth finally permanently flipping the axis of our universe. "You are the dependent. Your firm survives because I allow it. Your family's legacy remains intact because I bought its debt. Everything you thought made you a titan was actually just a leash, and I've been the one holding it the entire time." A tear broke free from Mike's eye, cutting a jagged path down his pale cheek. It wasn't a tear of sorrow for our marriage. It was the tear of a man mourning his own shattered reflection. The ego death was absolute. "Why give me the key now?" he asked, his voice entirely broken. "If I failed? If I'm nothing?" "Because I want you to feel the weight of it," I replied, stepping back and turning my gaze back to the sprawling, illuminated city. "I want you to hold the key to the kingdom you could have ruled, and know that you are only allowed inside as a guest. Keep it. Put it on your keychain. Let it remind you every single day of what happens when you decide someone isn't worth looking at." The air between us was finally clear. There were no more illusions, no more patronizing smiles, no more silent sacrifices. The marriage wasn't just dead. It had been autopsied, the cause of death laid bare on the glass desk between us. Mike slowly stood up. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. He simply slipped the heavy steel key into his pocket, the weight of it pulling the fabric of his suit downward, a permanent anchor to his new reality. He walked out of my office without another word, the click of the door sealing the tomb of the man he used to be. I stood alone in the quiet hum of the onyx, the cold, honest air filling my lungs. For the first time in 10 years I could finally breathe. The heavy brass handle of the door to Leritage was cool beneath my palm. As I pushed it open, the muffled symphonic hum of the dining room, the clinking of crystal, the low murmur of commerce and conversation, the ambient warmth of a world I had meticulously designed, faded away. The door clicked shut behind me, severing the umbilical cord to the chaos I had just orchestrated. I stepped out onto the pavement, and for the first time in 10 years, I was completely unapologetically alone. The night air was crisp, carrying the faint metallic scent of an impending rainstorm. I closed my eyes and inhaled deeply, letting the chill fill my lungs, freezing the last remnants of the Sterling family's suffocating atmosphere right out of my bloodstream. The city stretched out before me, a sprawling grid of neon and shadows, but it no longer felt like an imposing maze. It felt like a canvas. I began to walk, my heels clicking a steady, unhurried rhythm against the damp cobblestones. With every step, I felt a physical lightening, as if invisible lead weights were unspooling from my wrists and ankles. For a decade I had walked with my head slightly bowed, my shoulders pulled inward, shrinking myself to fit into the cramped, airless box labeled Mike's wife. I had worn the title of stay-at-home wife like a heavy velvet shroud. They had used that label as a weapon, a convenient shorthand for incompetence, a polite synonym for a parasite. But as the cool wind swept my hair back from my face, I realized that the shroud had actually been a cocoon. They had buried me in the dark, failing to realize that I was a seed. My mind briefly replayed the wreckage I had left behind in the private lounge, and the devastating silence of the office when Mike finally realized the weight of his own irrelevance. I had anticipated a rush of vindictive joy. I had spent years imagining the look on Lily's face when her aristocratic arrogance shattered, or the way Janet's voice would tremble when she realized her social survival depended on my mercy. I had dreamed of the moment Mike would finally see me and realize the monumental scale of his own blindness. Yet, walking beneath the amber glow of the street lamps, I felt no malice. The bitter, acidic taste of vengeance I had carried under my tongue for years had completely evaporated. Revenge, I realized, was a reactionary emotion. It required the perpetrator to still hold power over your heart. It required you to care about their pain. But I didn't care about their pain. Their shock, their terror, their shattered egos. None of it nourished me. I hadn't spent a decade working until my fingers bled and my eyes burned just to make the Sterlings feel small. They were already small. I had done it for dignity. Dignity is not something that can be handed to you by a husband who occasionally remembers you exist. It cannot be granted by a family that only values the bloodline of your bank account. Dignity is excavated. It is carved out of the bedrock of your own soul, built brick by brick in the silent, grueling hours when no one is watching and no one is clapping. I hadn't just built restaurants, holding companies and skyscrapers. I had built a fortress for my own self-worth. I had become the architect of my own life. I stopped at the corner of the avenue, the traffic light casting a wash of crimson over the wet asphalt. I looked down at my hands. They were the same hands that had gripped my father's callous fingers in that dusty small town all those years ago. They were the same hands that had typed frantic legal emails in a dark guest room while my husband slept, oblivious, down the hall. They were the hands of a creator. I was no longer a supporting character in a narrative written by men who underestimated me. I was the author, the financier, and the sole proprietor of my destiny. I turned around, letting my gaze drift back down the street toward the entrance of Leritage. From this distance, the restaurant looked like a beacon. The soft, golden light spilled out from the grand windows, painting the sidewalk in warm, inviting strokes. I could see the silhouette of Marcus at the host's stand, standing tall, commanding the room with the grace and authority I had trusted him with. I saw the patrons, the city's elite, the very people Janet and Lily worshipped, dining blissfully, entirely unaware that the ground they sat upon was owned by a woman they had likely brushed past on the street. It was a beautiful sight. But the secrecy that had made it beautiful was no longer necessary. The shadow had served its purpose. It had protected me while I was vulnerable, and it had hidden my ascent until I was untouchable. Now the shadow was just in the way. Tomorrow morning the embargo would lift. The press releases I had drafted weeks ago would hit the desks of every major financial publication in the city. The articles wouldn't speak of Vesper Global's anonymous backer. They would speak of Pamela. They would detail the hostile acquisitions, the brilliant real estate plays, the luxury developments, and the woman who had orchestrated it all from behind the velvet curtain. The world was going to wake up and finally know my name. The girl from the small town, the invisible wife, the nobody, she was dead. In her place stood a titan. I pulled my coat a little tighter around my shoulders, a genuine unburdened smile breaking across my face. The storm had passed, and the silence that had defined my adulthood was broken. I took a deep breath of the petrichor-laced air, turned my back on the restaurant, and walked forward into the night. I was Pamela, and I would never have to stay quiet again. Thank you so much for walking this journey with me to the very end. Your time, your attention, and your presence mean the absolute world to me. Pamela's story is a reminder that our greatest strength often grows in the quietest, darkest places. It shows us that being underestimated isn't a weakness. Sometimes, it is our greatest advantage. No matter where you come from or who is doubting you right now, please remember that you have the power to be the architect of your own life. I would love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever felt unseen, or had to quietly build your own strength while others doubted your worth? How did you find your voice? Please, share your feelings and your own stories in the comments below. Your journey matters, and reading your experiences truly inspires me and everyone else in this community. If Pamela's story touched your heart, or if you found a spark of motivation in her quiet strength, please consider subscribing to Queen's Revenge. Together, we are building a space for strong, resilient individuals who refuse to stay in the shadows any longer. Keep building your empire even if you have to do it in the dark. Thank you again from the bottom of my heart, and I will see you in the next story.